So the students are now welcome to pose questions. So if you line up, please.
Should we do the same thing again where we say our names and our seat of... Our name and school, yeah. August Henderson Jonsson, Sweden, Victor Rydberg Odenplans Gymnasium. I'm going to start right out of the gate by being a little controversial because we talked about sustainable development and one of the...
I can't really hear what you're saying.
Sorry?
You have a hard time hearing what you're saying, I think.
Oh, sorry. One of the biggest issues facing our planet today and the issue of climate change in particular is that of energy. And you talked about renewable energy. I just wanted to find your professional opinion on nuclear energy as a substitute for coal and oil.
For you.
Well, I don't think we have to be sort of purist on these things, and I think we need to do the best we can in all possible areas. I do think there's a problem with nuclear, which is not perhaps so much the potential nuclear accidents, which has scared people, of course, in the past, more that it's hugely expensive. And so it may be that we don't need to impose having at least these big nuclear power stations on people when there is the possibility of using any number of other renewable energy sources. So I would say keep nuclear going if you've got it there, but think very, very hard before building big nuclear power stations.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so Mattias Acke, Katedralskolan Lund. I have a question for Carl Folke. So we have, in the past, we've had these green movements which have played the blame game, if you can say that, very hard. Is this, since this has indeed helped change the habits of, for example, Swedes who are now very anxious when flying, but it has also fueled, for example, climate critics. What are your thoughts on this this method of going forward?
Well, I think if we only talk about collapse and disasters, it will be difficult. So I think, and then it will be really awful, actually. I think so. We have to look into the solutions and turn the whole thing around, and to be positive about that. I think we actually are seeing the changes now going really fast, actually. Just to think about how the climate issue now is taken up in policy and among young generation and everything, that if you go back 5 years, that wouldn't have happened. If I go back, I started with these things in the early 80s, actually, and I think it was not less than 10 years, perhaps especially 5 years ago, since the whole private sector has really woken up, actually, and are acting much faster, actually, than the politicians are doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Morgan Ekpring, Åkerskolan. I have a question for Joanna. What are your thoughts about the climate change denial and how to affect world leaders such as Donald Trump and Nigel Farage to care more about the global warming?
I heard the first part of the question. What do I think about climate change deniers? I didn't hear the second part.
And how to affect the world leaders such as Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, who doesn't care about.
If only. I think climate change denial is quite an interesting psychological, social phenomenon. I mean, there are some people who obviously got vested interests. They own coal mines or whatever, and they clearly don't want to have their way of life changed. But there's a large number of just the general population who I think are sort of recalcitrant because they don't want to be told what to do. They say, oh, you green lefties, we're going to carry on with doing what we've always done in the past and it's always been good and go away. So there's a certain sort of mindset. I can't understand quite why they feel that way. I mean, rather like earlier we had, you don't have to believe in global warming, you know, when it's a fact. You don't have to believe that the Earth is round and not flat. I mean, it's a fact. The evidence for climate change being due to human activity is so unequivocal that I don't know why people are still carrying on like this, unless they got vested interests, which leads you, of course, into the second part of the question. And President Trump has clearly got vested interests, so push him to one side. But there does seem to be a problem in the US of A, and I'm apologising to Americans in the audience here. They're much behind the curve I think, in the general population in understanding this is a global issue that needs to be addressed. And with them withdrawing from the Paris Accord, it is a bit of a worry. In fact, when they first did that, I was really scared because I thought, oh my goodness, the whole thing's going to fall down like a pack of cards. And it didn't, and mainly because China and India and other countries said, no, we're going to do it anyway. We can see other reasons for wanting to do it, and we're going to try and decarbonise our economies, and that's very, very encouraging.
There are, of course, a lot of deniers, and there are, as we heard before, there are evolution deniers in large numbers, even though the evidence is pretty good. There are people who oppose vaccination, even though the evidence is pretty good. I think it's a modern phenomenon of being able to ignore the evidence and come up with your own personal views.
Thank you.
My name is Louise, and I come from the French school here in Stockholm. And my question is for Sir Christopher Dobson. And that is, if there are any general changes that we can do as individuals in our everyday life to prevent the expected increase of people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think, as with sort of heart disease, there are lots of things you can do that decrease it. The evidence is at the moment that, well, we have very little evidence, because actually we have very little length of time when these things have been explored. Carol Brain in Cambridge, for example, has shown that if you look at the probability of getting Alzheimer's disease at a given age, it's actually lower now than it was 30 years ago, but it's only lower by about 5%. So I think being healthy, fit, studying chemistry and things like this is extremely positive. It's a great marketing tool for PhDs. But I think the evidence is there's a limit to what you can do, because this is really a sort of collapse of the regulatory systems that have never been designed to operate to these ages. So I think you can do some deferral, but I think it's very limited, and we will have to rely on drugs of some sort to control the vast number of these diseases. But it's a very interesting topic. Equally, I might add, there's very little evidence that factors induce Alzheimer's disease, for example. There's all sorts of evidence about pesticides and things like this, but the evidence is very slim.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ylva Lorentzon, and I come from Donner Gymnasiet in Gothenburg. And I have a question for Professor Haigh. Well, we see extreme weather events increasing, and in many regions, poor regions, people don't want to be evacuated since their houses is all they have, and leaving them is risking, well, everything they got, even though they might, well, die. How do you think as a society we should, well, take care of this problem and try to, well, help these people?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult problem. I mean, the number one thing is to stop climate change happening so that is not so much of a problem. We do need governments, local governments, as well as national governments, to plan for certain events, and that can include coastal flooding, or it can include wildfires, it can include all of these things, and it needs organisation and planning to make sure people are helped under those circumstances. So it's a question of getting the right legislation and the right governments.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Annabel and I'm from Stockholm Gymnasiet, Gothenburg. My question is for you, Sir Christopher Dobson. Do you think we could ever stop this misfolding of proteins from happening? And if so, how?
I think, the question of whether one can stop misfolding is very interesting, because if it weren't for the protective mechanisms in biology, this would happen all the time. And there are various things that happen. For example, our proteins are compartmentalized, which stops the sort of catalysis of aggregation. It's now known when disease sets in that there's a down-regulation of the genes which are producing proteins which are very aggregation prone. And the whole chaperone mechanism, the proteins which are thought to be largely initially to do with making sure proteins folded, now actually seem to be more important, really, I think, in ensuring that proteins don't misfold. And so I think the strategy that we and others have adopted is to try to find molecules that will mimic what happens naturally. Some of these things are very difficult. I mean, if you upregulate chaperones, they control all sorts of processes, and I think it's pretty dangerous. But I think, with designed antibodies, potentially modified chaperones, and hopefully, small molecules which mimic these. And I think one of the very surprising things has been that it is possible to mimic these very sophisticated biological molecules if you really understand the processes that they regulate. So I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to find therapeutic molecules that will act in a very similar way to natural molecules to decrease the probability. They'll decrease the risk of it happening. They're not going to stop it. But I think if you reduce the risk, then the incidence will go down significantly.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I am Katarina Kurina, a student from Estonia, and I would like to ask Professor Dobson if that's true or only a myth that if you are left-handed and learn how to do things with your right hand, then it strengthens the connection between your cerebral hemispheres and so helps to avoid Alzheimer's disease.
I think it's an interesting suggestion. I wouldn't discourage you from trying it. I think, again, one of the problems with Alzheimer's is there are two real problems. One is it's a very recent phenomenon where very large numbers of people have been affected. And the other is that it's very hard to identify one factor particularly. And statistics can be very misleading. For example, it was shown at one point that, or was claimed at one point that smoking reduced the risk of Alzheimer's disease, but it turned out that the analysis just worked in decades. And it's certainly true that between 70 and 80, smokers are less likely to die of Alzheimer's disease. The reason is they've already died of lung cancer. So I think the statistics are very hard to analyze, but my personal view is all these things are worth exploring. I mean, there's not going to be a single mechanism that stops this disease, and so I'd very strongly, are you left-handed?
I'm both-handed.
Ah, well then you're doing science. You're okay. You shouldn't have to worry about it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ted Långström, and I'm from Denskolan Fagersta. And I have an open question. With the overshoot day coming earlier and earlier every year, the day that we use up all the resources we have for make that year, how can we make the day come later each year in a way? Do you have any advice on it?
I think yes.
Okay, I think a lot of is happening in that direction now. It's sort of big awakening up on resource efficiency and circular economy being discussed, at least in Europe, and also China is taking a lot of measures in that direction, which basically means that you just don't use a resource and throw it away, but you let it go many times around in society. The part that is still missing a bit is what I tried to talk about today, the connection to the broader planet and the biosphere, and to become stewards of our own future by collaborating with the climate flows and the ecosystems that we have around us. But that's going to come very fast now, I think, also.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ines and I'm from Soltorpsgymnasiet. I have a question for Professor Haigh, and I hope you can answer it. Are there any animals that would benefit from climate changes and rising temperatures?
So I'm not a biologist and I don't know about animals, but I know that it's not all bad for everybody all the time. So I was talking about heat waves. It may be that in the northern latitudes, a few more cold periods might actually suit you. So I can't answer your question, really. I don't know about animals in particular, but it's not all bad in all directions. So I guess there may be some animals that will benefit. Does anybody know the answer to that?
Arctic foxes. Yeah.
Arctic foxes, he says.
but we know that there's a lot of animals really starting to move around, actually. So you can see that in the oceans, that a lot of fish species have starting to migrate to new places, and also that we get a lot of insects moving around. So it's a lot of changes going on in migration patterns that we didn't have before.
Thank you.
I think the rates of change are very slow is the problem. It's not like bacteria, which can react very quickly.
Absolutely.
It takes a long time, like human populations, for example, reacting to measles in the US. It takes a long time before you build up resistance. You can change your conditions.
Hi, my name is Phyllis from Globala Gymnasiet in Stockholm. And I want to thank you all for being here and talking at this symposium. And I was wondering, since we are in such a critical situation with climate change and we in the developed world need to take such drastic action, what are your thoughts on holding symposiums like this where we fly in people to speak about climate change?
You should cycle in.
It's a real concern, and I'm trying to fly less, definitely fly less than I used to for all the conferences, but you are absolutely right. And when we organise meetings nowadays, we think first, would it be sensible for us to try and do this when it's a group of, say, less than about 25 people, to do this electronically by Skype or whatever, to have the meeting that way. But there are some meetings where you actually need to talk to people. And I suppose the only thing is to try and limit the numbers of those that we run and that you go to. At the same time, we need to do a lot of work on aviation fuel so that we will be able to fly and not have lots of carbon emissions. And there's certainly a lot of work going on hydrogen-fueled planes and other aviation fuels in the future. So let's hope it won't be as bad as all that.
Thank you.
You should also know that flying is not the biggest emission. Also, it's coming from burning of producing cement and this type of sectors.
Yes.
Actually.
So
it's not so. It's important to know that to have distance also to what you read in the newspaper and hear in the news. You alluded to that before, that it's not necessarily super true everything that just comes out and create these storms, because.
There is a huge amount of unnecessary travel. I mean,
of course.
The drop in airline fares with cheap airlines, for example, cheap seats, has just mean that people can go away for the weekend on a whim.
Absolutely.
And I think I think it's more important you come to a meeting on climate change than actually you fly off to the Seychelles for a couple of days.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Willow. I come from Florida Atlantic University in Florida, and I was wondering if any of you could speak about the methane production in the dairy industry, and how, if there is a solution to that, what it might be.
Yes, so agriculture contributes about a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions that we are suffering from today, and a large proportion of that is from dairy and beef cattle. And so that's one of the recommendations for people to eat less meat, is actually to try and cut down on those sorts of animals being farmed. I think that's probably as much as I've got to say on that one. Did you want to add? No.
Thank you.
My name is William. I'm from Gymnasiet Motala, and my question is for Professor Sir Christopher Dobson. You were talking about how Alzheimer's was caused by aggregates of these amyloid plaques, but it's also damage to the hippocampus. So do we know if the aggregation is localized, or is the damage somehow localized and the aggregation is uniform? And if so, why?
So it's a question whether or not amyloid plaques are the determinants of disease, or whether they're just a consequence.
Well, my question is, if the amyloid plaques cause the disease, is it because the aggregation is localized in the area near the hippocampus, or if the aggregation is uniform throughout the brain, but the damage is somehow localized?
Well, I think one of the things which is, still interesting about these diseases is there is a lot of controversy as to exactly what causes the is the primary determinant of disease. I mean, I think most people think that the amyloid plaques are very important, but actually not necessarily the major factors. But you know, I think that the question of how you address these things therapeutically is very difficult. But we just need more evidence. And one of the problems with Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and so on is the diagnostics are so poor. They're very poor biomarkers for the disease. So it's very difficult to know what causes the origin and whether you change the levels of certain species, whether it makes a big difference or not. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, a bit, I think.
The answer is probably no, but actually, did I miss the point on that?
No, I think it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Mats Gard from Ove Gymnasium here in Stockholm. And this is a question for mainly Professor Haigh. And let's say we make it. We stop emissions. We go below 1.5 degrees. So next problem. With the graph you showed of ice age, and that would be because of the Earth's rotation around the sun. How much more greenhouse gases would we have to emit to negate the next ice age?
So this is a question that has been people addressed, and I think your colleagues in Sweden have looked at this quite a lot. And there's a certain feeling that by the time you've got to 1.5 or 2 degrees, you're in a different scenario where actually you've already possibly stopped the onset of an ice age, because it does require this push from the sun, but then the gases to compound it to actually have the effect. And I think if by the time we get to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we've actually shifted into a new scenario where we're not going to get another ice age. That was one suggestion, I think, from Johan Rockström.
That's what I heard also, is that we have sort of the ice age dynamics has been going on for, I think it is 1.2 million years or something like that dynamics, but we are out of that dynamics now to something new, which sort of an unknown terrain to some extent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josef from Rudbecksgymnasiet Tidaholm, and I have a question to Sir Christopher Dobson. How far away do you think we are from putting an efficient drug to use for Alzheimer's?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and the answer is we don't really know. But I think that there are some very optimistic possibilities. For example, if small molecules are going to be effective, there are a lot of drugs which are actually in use that have passed all the safety trials and so forth, which may not have been efficacious for the particular disease. And we found actually that some of these seem to be very, very effective inhibitors. So there's a possibility that one could repurpose drugs and put them into the clinic. That's still going to take multiple years. I mean, the typical time between going into clinical trials and actually getting a drug is more than 10 years and costs billions of dollars. But with luck, there will be some fast tracking. And as I commented before, one of the problems is that, although it's been very heavily worked on, again, it's a very recent disease in the sense of people studying it. And we don't really have the ability to detect it at an early stage. And one of the problems is that a lot of the clinical trials, for example, have been done when, it's much too late. And I think so one of the very important things to get drugs into the clinic quickly is actually to have a look at the way that the regulatory authorities allow drugs to be tested, because you really need to apply these much earlier. I mean, I think it's a bit like taking a statin when you just had a heart attack at the moment. It's unlikely to be effective. It doesn't mean that if you take it 10 years beforehand, it isn't going to be effective. So my guess is there will be multiplicities of drugs coming onto the market, although many big pharma have actually abandoned the area because they think it's too difficult, but now actually there's so much more understood about it. I would be surprised if there weren't effective drugs within 10 years. But actually, I think it may be like chemotherapy for cancer, that actually the initial drugs were not very effective. And as time goes on, they become better. And as more is known about genetics and so forth, they get better still. So I'm avoiding answering your question because I don't know the answer. But I am an optimist. I think this is such a big problem. And in $100 trillion is an awful lot of money. And you already know that most people in this room, I'm sure, know of somebody who's affected by Alzheimer's disease, and it's totally socially destructive. So I think gradually people are realizing this is a major problem that needs to be addressed. And at the moment, when I started this, it was a sort of niche area. Now I think it needs the equivalent to the National Cancer Act in 1971 from Nixon to generate money. But again, cancer was greatly aided by the publicity about AIDS and high-profile people saying research had to be done. The people with Alzheimer's disease are much less able to articulate the reason for it, and a lot of people just think, well, they're old anyway. So I think one of the arguments is that your generation will end up having to support a huge number of people with this illness. Maybe 50% of older people ultimately, and the social destruction will be huge. So I think that what it needs is a lot more emphasis on it, a lot more people going to this area of science, and a lot more funding, and a change, I think, in the way that regulatory authorities look at this disease compared with others.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Piero from Klara Västra. This is a question for Professor Haigh. So you were talking about CO2 absorbing energy. So can't we start using CO2 as an energy source instead of trying to replace it with renewable energy?
So use CO2 as an energy source?
Yeah, like producing electricity or something like that.
So
I think I can answer
okay.
that. So the simple answer is by solar energy you could generate electricity, and the electricity could be used to electrolyze water, and the hydrogen produced then could be combined with the carbon dioxide to a fuel. That will also amend the problem that we heard before with the flight conscience. You will go on with aviation.
Cool. Thank you.
Could you collect the methane from cows?
Yes.
A device could be added to collect it.
Hi, my name is Laila and I go to Öresundsgymnasiet in Landskrona. So actually I have many questions, but there's a small amount of time. So it's mostly to Professor Haigh and Folke. I believe that we should learn from each other. Everybody who shares the same opinions and goals should learn from each other. So I guess my question to you is, what difficulties did you have to face when explaining these threats to non-believers in that sense, and how did you deal with these?
Yes, well, I've had a lot of discussions, particularly if you go on the public radio and you talk about climate change, you then get that followed up by lots of people writing to you, and generally, well, a few people write nice things, but most people write horrid things, because they think you're making it up, or you're got some sort of agenda, or you're just stupid, or so. When people write to me and they say personally offensive things, I don't answer. I mean, I'm not going to enter into that sort of discussion. If people write to me and say, you've got the science wrong because, and they give a reason, then I reply and try and explain why they got it wrong. They very rarely take the advice, and then I don't engage in an ongoing discussion. But I do think you have to try and engage with these people to a certain extent, because you can't just dismiss them all and say, oh, you're all stupid. You have to try and understand what are the issues that people are coming up with. it's quite a battle. I have to say, with all these people that I've written to, I've probably converted about 2%, so it's not a great success rate.
So the patience is very important and a factor in that kind of discussion.
Yes, and I think also nowadays we've got a lot more education in schools. So, I mean, kids know more about the greenhouse effect than their parents, and so the children can try and persuade the parents.
But I think also to have these dialogues, for example, like we're having now with the seafood companies, it's amazing that when you sit in a group and start to talk about these things, you know, how you can get visions and action going, and avoid the sort of the fighting. So I think that's really encouraging, I think.
Yes, and that's a good point you made earlier about people in the community who these sorts of people would respect. They might not respect greeny, sciencey sort of people, but they would respect the Governor of the Bank of England. So when the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, gets up and says, climate change is a problem, and we've got to do something about it, and that a lot of businesses, as you've pointed out, are now understanding that it's a problem, that is coming from a completely different direction, so that the general population can say, oh, it's not just a sort of ambition of, you know, Extinction Rebellion people who are making a fuss, it's actually serious business people are concerned.
So another important aspect you mean is to get the same opinion from different directions.
So I didn't catch that.
To share the same opinion, like from different directions.
Yes, exactly, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure listening to all of you.
Hey, my name is Jenny Jonason from Henderson Gymnasium, and I have a question to all of you, and that is, technology is everywhere now, and one thing that has got more common in recent years are artificial intelligence, and there is a lot of research going on there now, and I saw a clip of Max Tegmark, who has written books about this, where he said that he thought that AI could be a solution to climate problems. And my question is, do you think AI could be a solution to climate problems, or do you think there is other solutions that are better?
Well, I could just say my view. I think so far the whole technological revolution we're in right now has not been connected to the planet. But if it becomes connected, I think there's an enormous scope for doing good things with it. So basically, and I think AI has a big potential role to play there to sort of enhance the stewardship challenge. Because the stewardship challenge is not just an ethical issue, it's about the survival issues.
I mean, I personally think it's a very very good question. I mean, it's not going to be a solution, but one of the issues is there's such a lot of data out there,
yes,
much of which is not very good. And I think actually being able to process it in intelligent ways is going to have a huge impact. I mean, I mentioned, for example, in Alzheimer's, we have no idea about many of these factors that could make it worse or could even improve it. But actually, I think it just needs a much more intelligent way of analyzing huge amounts of data. Yeah. So I think it really has huge potential.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Tengselius, and I'm from the International High School from Gothenburg region. And I have two questions to Professor Dobson. The first one is, what functional groups are present in small molecules drugs?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, what functional groups are present in the small molecule drugs?
Well, that's very interesting, actually. The answer is quite a lot of different molecules seem to be effective, because what they need to do is to interact with these rather sticky components of the aggregates. So, for example, a lot of them are very classical groups that you see, aromatic groups and so forth, that are very characteristic of most drugs that actually exist, because they have to cross cell barriers and so forth, or even the blood-brain barrier. So what we found is actually a lot of the potential drugs we found are actually very similar to drugs which have been developed already, because they do have to be compatible with biological systems, they do have to be non-toxic, they do have to cross membranes, and I think that there's nothing dramatically special about these drugs, because most drugs have to have these compatibility issues with biology.
Yeah, and what amino acids are responsible for causing nucleation, and are they always hydrophobic interactions?
So what amino acids are?
What amino acids are responsible for causing nucleation, and are they always hydrophobic?
Well, the answer is that they're not always hydrophobic, but there are some patterns of residues which are very effective. You need to generate beta sheets in these, and there are certainly patterns of residues that, for example, alternating hydrophobic residues which cause amphipathic interactions. There's a lot of evidence that groups of, for example, phenylalanine, actually, and tyrosine is aromatic groups, but there's actually also evidence that really quite hydrophilic groups are also very important. And I think, as I sort of mentioned, you can get these aggregates from homopolymers of all sorts of different species, but I think that there are patterns emerging that make certain sequences more likely. One of the other issues is the patterns of sequences that generate low complexity molecules, highly disordered species, are also important, because if the sequences generate highly stable folded proteins, then that's a protection against these aggregates.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Elina Larsson, and I'm from Jämtlands Gymnasium Variantin in Östersund. And my question is mostly for Professor Haigh. And I've read about these bubbles of greenhouse gases trapped in ices in Siberia mainly. Yes. And my question is, how do you view those gases will affect the environment, and will we get to like a tipping point where those gases do make it like the environment get warmer and then more gases emerge and so forth, so we can't stop anymore?
Absolutely right. So this is one big concern, and as you pointed out, that is one of the potential tipping points. This is mainly methane that's trapped in permafrost and claterates at the bottom of the ocean, and as the temperature rises, they get released, and then they're very potent greenhouse gases, thereby adding to the greenhouse effect, making things warmer, and that is part of the picture with the ice age cycles. So that was what happened as part of the emissions of the greenhouse gases in response to warming, and then very slowly they get taken back into the stores again when you go back into an ice age. So that is a real concern, yes.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mark Spoonman from Åbo Gymnasium, and my question is to Professor Dobson, and that is, how come Alzheimer's is such an epidemic disease, and why does so many people get it?
I think the real characteristic of Alzheimer's disease is it's very, very strongly age-related. So at 65, you have a very small chance of getting it. 85, you've got a 50% chance of getting it. And so as the number of people over the age of 65 goes up, the number of people suffering from the disease increases. And I think the reason is that we rely in our bodies on these regulatory systems, the processes which actually prevent this happening. And so long as they prevent it happening successfully, then we're fine. But at a certain point, the whole sort of homeostasis system collapses. I think it's a bit like email. When you're young, you get a lot of email, but you've got time and you can handle it and you're very efficient. As you get older, you have less time, there's more junk mail comes in. But so long as you keep your inbox under control, you're fine. But as soon as you don't, then you get a whole set of stuff in there, and you can't actually discover what's useful from the rest of it. So I think it's this again, it's a sort of tipping point. It's going from when the regulatory system is able to cope with problems through to the situation where it just cannot deal with it, and the whole system collapses. And above the age of 65, the risk just goes up substantially because there are more proteins which are damaged and so forth. There's more problems with oxidative stress. The regulatory systems become less effective. And so there's this crossover between when you can control this process and when you can't.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jack Kjellberg. I'm from the French school here in Stockholm. And I have a question for Professor Folke. A large part of the problem with climate change is that it is this feedback loop. Particularly, for example, if you look at coastal cities and rising waters, they will have to do something to prevent waters from flooding all the houses and stuff. But the reduction of infrastructure, like cement, also causes additional global warming. And I was wondering if you have any idea on how to sort of try to prevent the feedback loop from increasing.
I think it is about a lot of changes in the infrastructure of how we do things today, actually. How we build roads and how we build houses. We're probably going to use much more wood or other materials in the future, probably try to phase out cement completely, I would guess. So that's my general comment there is it's in the infrastructure shifts that are really resource and energy demanding that we have to, those are the ones we should concentrate on, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I think there's lots of technological solutions that may be needed to solve all these problems, which is a great opportunity for young people to do new stuff and also for countries to invest in people, and thereby it's an economic, profit-making activity. So it's not just a drain and a hair shirt and all bad. There's some good side to it too.
Thanks.
Cheers, my name is Ali from Täby Enskilda Gymnasium. First, I would like to thank you all for taking your time and having these very thought-provoking presentations for us. My question is quite open. It is, we grasp the business in eco-sustainability, and my question is what role will businesses play in the future for the transition to a sustainable future?
That's a good question.
Yeah, ideally, governments should set up the playing rules for both business and citizens, actually.
Yeah.
But as we know today, the government system is not really doing that in so many places right now, actually. Perhaps in China, actually, but that's another type of governance structure than we used to in this part of the world. But therefore, because of the urgency, that's why we started to interact with big business and especially transnational corporations to try to tip around the situation fast. I think as long as we have a market-based system and trade going on the planet, I think business will play a really big role in these type of issues. Of course, business is run by profits, but there is a shift, as I see it, of also taking on new purposes and new meaning. And that seems to also to come from people who want to work in these businesses. So it's another ethics actually starting to emerge. And I think we should speed up that ethics and connect it to this challenge of becoming stewards of our own future in concert with the planet we're living on.
So in terms of, sorry.
I was going to say, I assume that there are, I don't know anything about it really, but there are strong economic arguments for going in for alternative
Absolutely.
energy. New businesses are developing. And
absolutely.
Presumably, even if you have huge oil resources, if you're not going to pump them out, the
stranded assets,
the value of your investment starts to drop.
So there's a whole international movement on what's called financial disclosures, climate-related financial disclosures, where companies are encouraged or required to state what are the risks of their profits with regard to climate. And so companies then have to state our risks are such and such and such and such. That has to go into the reports, and then people who are investing in those companies can then think, maybe that I don't think my money is quite so safe in this very risky company, and they move their money elsewhere. So it's a sort of indirect way of discouraging investment in climate risky companies. There's also, sorry to carry on a bit, in terms of regulation, there's a lot of discussion about carbon markets. So companies have to pay for any carbon that they emit, because the price is the real, where the question really arises. You can do it inside countries, and China now has got a quite strongly regulated internal carbon market. And I know the EC has one. I don't know how well it's legislated, but they certainly have one set up. If you could have an internationally agreed carbon market, that would really drive behaviour to produce less carbon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Christian. I'm from Södertälje. I'm studying at Telegymnasiet. And Professor Haigh, you said before that for stopping or at least reducing the problem of global warming, we should not only stop or at least reducing our emissions of carbon dioxide, but we also should remove some of the existing one from the atmosphere. But how is it even possible? I mean, is there a practical solution to it? For example, I don't know, reproducing the photosynthesis on a big scale, or a material that, I don't know, collects CO2 or pumping it out in the space?
So there's lots of wonderful physical chemists and biologists working on many of these questions as to how to extract CO2 out of the air and create something useful out of it. The two ways that are currently seen to be the best way forward, but neither of them is really a panacea. One is it's called direct air capture. So the carbon dioxide is being emitted into the air by power stations, and in the power station chimneys you have chemical procedures for sucking the CO2 out the air. You then put it into a form where it's buried underground and sort of becomes part of the rocks and stays there forever. It's called carbon sequestration. Another way involves plants, and the idea here is that you grow plants for fuel. So the plants take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, you burn the plants for fuel, the CO2 is released again, and then you do the carbon capture. So that way you've got your energy at no carbon cost. But there's big problems with both of those ideas, and what we need is a lot more bright young things thinking up ideas of how to solve this problem. Please.
But you shouldn't burn the plants. That's the way of taking care of the carbon dioxide. So.
Well, yes, but then you don't get the energy.
You can get the CO2 back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They tend to be expensive, all these.
Yes.
Okay.
And not.
Hello, I'm a student at Florida Atlantic University High School. My name is Kylie Long, and I have a question for Professor Dobson. So, what further potential do you see in the use of stem cells to study Alzheimer's, and also what medical inaccuracies may arise through this approach?
I mean, the use of, I think one of the great excitements in therapy has been the incredible use of stem cells and the value of this. And I think you're probably implying something very important, which is if you could reduce the levels of the aggregation-prone proteins, then it's very unlikely that then you'd reduce significantly the propensity to aggregate, and therefore you reduce the problem. And in some cases, if the protein isn't important, if you got rid of it completely, then it would essentially solve the problem. Actually, it's very interesting. We could cure Alzheimer's disease by making mutations in the protein that would reduce its propensity to aggregate dramatically, as you see in the fruit fly experiment. So I think it's a very promising route. It's probably easier in the diseases which are wholly familial, genetic, like Huntington's disease. But I think it's a really important issue, and stem cell processes are developing at with huge speed at the moment. Did I miss the second part of your question?
The second part was what medical inaccuracies could come up through this approach?
medical
inaccuracies?
Well, I think, do you mean in fact side effects of it, or actually the fact that one isn't doing the right experiments?
No, like when using stem cells, like anything that might not actually translate into treatment, like might be inaccurate.
Yeah, no, this is a huge problem, and I think as research, again, stem cell research is very new, and I think as this improves, I think that there will be massive reduction in these types of problems. But it's a very, very interesting question. You should definitely work in this area.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have only 4 more questions, or 5. So I think the gentleman that put up at the end, Okay.
Hi, I'm Elisa from Telegymnasiet in Södertälje. I have a question to Professor Haigh. You showed the graph of how temperature and CO2 went up and down, like over the years. So what caused them to go down, and why can't we reach that now?
Are you talking about the plot with the ice ages, where it's 100,000 year scale? So the idea there is the initial changes are due to changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun. So very slowly, the orbit is not a circle, it's an ellipse, and the parameters of the ellipse change very slowly with time. So when the Earth is nearer the Sun, it's warmer, and when it's further from the Sun, it's cooler. So it's those things which will do the initial warming and cooling, but then it's the effect of the greenhouse gases in response to those warmings and coolings that actually create the temperature changes that we see in the graph. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Martin Merilath. I study at Tartu Jan Buska Gymnasium from Estonia. I would ask 2 questions if that's okay.
No, because we had people chopped off.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had people who had to leave the queue.
Yeah, I chopped it off.
I think you get
so
one
the first question would go to Professor Haigh. Regarding the global climate change, Australia has been one of the countries hit most. So do you think their current situation is still reversible? And what would it take to actually fix Australia and its problems currently?
Are you talking about a sort of land use fix, or are you talking about a political fix?
More like running out of drinking water and just the heat of the ocean around it and everything like that.
Yes, they've actually got quite a good scheme in Australia for monitoring water use by farms and calculating it. So that's quite a good system they've got there at the moment. What they haven't got is any constraints on fossil fuel use. And you can see that their emissions are going up and up and up, and I think that's actually a political thing that needs to be done rather than anything more subtle.
And the second question was maybe for the whole table. Throughout the day, we've heard echoing that we need unity and a sense of community throughout the world. But recently we've seen countries such as the USA or the UK withdrawing from these bigger United Nations, and what do you think that there is a way to convince our political leaders to work together and appreciate the gift of life, as Donald put it earlier?
How to persuade the politicians?
I think when we look at tipping points and these type of things, what you see is when you're approaching tipping points, you have lower resilience in the system. So what you see is that the variance increases enormously. And in my mind, I think that's what we're seeing now in society also, an enormous variance in opinions and almost like conflicting ways of thinking. And if you want to look at it positively, that's a space that allows for new ideas and new visions to emerge also. So if a good leader pops up right now or within the next 5-10 years, a couple of good leaders, I think that can make an enormous difference, which you would not be able to do under more stable conditions.
Politicians, of course, respond to the populace.
Yes.
And one's seen in France, for example,
Yes.
that attempts to do this. So I think, it's not just the politicians, it's actually trying to get an atmosphere that these are actually things which are worth reducing your standard of living for, perhaps, at least temporarily.
Well, you'll lose votes if you don't do it. I mean,
Exactly.
that's the bottom line.
So the thing to do is to agree to do it and not to do it. Which I think is one of the big problems.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
Final question.
Yeah, my name is Nicole Savalis from Campus Manila Gymnasium in Stockholm. And my question is if you think that artificial photosynthesis would be a solution for the carbon dioxide emissions. If it's economically possible to produce it like in a larger scale, because I know that it's been that it exists, but maybe not in a larger scale, so that it actually helps our planet.
So I can't answer about artificial photosynthesis. I know that there's schemes of artificial trees which are sort of, but I think they're taking in CO2 in different ways. And there's also schemes where you put algae into panels and put them on walls. But I think that's also real photosynthesis. So perhaps there's some chemists here. She's just looking around. Nick, do you know?
Perhaps what's being talked about is known as solar fuels. And there are lots of people who work on methods that would use solar energy combined with CO2 from the atmosphere. And that would indeed be artificial photosynthesis.
And I think your question involved the scale-up, didn't it, as well? Which I think is one of the real challenges. Yeah. You can get things to work in the lab, but actually want to get them to work in the real world. It is still a huge problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just comment? I think the world's in great shape with young people. I was impressed not just by the quality of the questions, but actually by the depth of knowledge below them, which I think is really, it was incredibly impressive.
Yeah, so we should thank not only the three speakers of this afternoon session, but also the great questions, the great young, this is the future. So we give them a hand, all of them.